Australia now becomes the second country to raise its terror level because of ISIS. Prime Minister Tony Abbott telling his people this morning that the concern is coming from Islamic militants located within the country's borders.
Our security agencies have raised the threat level based on an accumulation of indicators. The numbers of Australians in the Middle East fighting with and supporting terrorist groups. The numbers who have returned from the Middle East having fought with terrorist groups.
This is a concern for America as well, with senators like John McCain, among others, pointing to our porous borders as a way in for terrorists. Yet investors standing pat. With me right now, Todd Schoenberger of J. Stryker Asset Management and Jason Pride of Glenmead. Gentlemen, good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. So 2 countries now raising the threat level, and yet no reaction from investors. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's a couple of reasons for this, Maria. One, it's that we're hearing about the threats, but we haven't actually seen the event take place. So granted, if we've been going through this since 9/11, September 11th, we've had numerous threats. We've had numerous warnings. We've also had the color-coded diagram that the U.S. government had created years ago. But here's the thing. We haven't seen that one event. And when we do see that event, that's going to be the catalyst that sends markets reeling.
Yeah, but I mean, social media has been a huge driver in attracting Australians into the Middle East battlefields. You know, I mean, this is an issue. Yesterday, we spoke with former New York Police Department Commissioner Ray Kelly, and he also discussed social media as being a big recruiting tool for terrorists. Listen to this.
Obviously, one of the concerns we have is these lone wolves, people who are motivated. Some of them radicalize themselves on the internet without any real direct contact with anyone else.
So with social media and terror concern, are we looking at restrictions on Twitter, on Facebook? I mean, do you see this impacting the social media space in any way?
Well, I'll take that first, because here's the thing. I'm kind of confused by the fact that we're worried about Twitter actually being the venue of getting these people, these radicals, to actually have this jihad movement around the globe. Look, if that's the case, then why doesn't the United States, why don't you get the EU to get together and actually do its own proactive social media campaign? I find that to be a very, very weak excuse, because bottom line is it's a culture that's out there. It's a movement, and it's going to take years again, just like we went through with Al-Qaeda, to actually turn us around.
So what do we do, Jason, and why aren't the markets reacting?
Look, the markets aren't reacting because there's no economic impact that's come forward yet, right? When we have any of these risk events, typically you see the risk spike, the markets will react. We haven't seen a major risk event yet on this item alone. We've seen some of the ones in the Middle East. We've seen some things abroad and with Russia and Ukraine, and the markets have reacted to that. But those are actual events. Here is a just heightened risk level that's brought in. Economic impact, I'm searching for the mechanism. I mean, could you have regulatory impact that ends up clouding the businesses of social media stocks for a very small portion of the market? Maybe. But economic impact, I'm having a hard time seeing the actual driver here.
Look, I don't mean to be the bearer of doom, right? But here's one of the top headlines of the day. EU imposing new economic sanctions on Russia over Ukraine. The European Union putting into effect a new round of sanctions against Russia over its role in Ukraine, including restrictions on financing for some Russian state-owned companies and asset freezes on leading Russian politicians. So far, these sanctions have dealt with individuals and some business dealings, but not overall, sectors. If we see sanctions on the oil sector, he's going to come back with his own counter sanctions. That may very well be a destabilizing thing for Europe.
And here's where we see a big possible impact. This is the one item that we are focused on, is the Ukraine-Russian situation. But at the same time, you look at the underlying data, okay? It's a real risk because about 1% of the European Union's economy comes from exports to Russia. So that could be cut off. And this is an economy that's only running at about a 1% growth rate at best right now. So you can see a significant impact there. But the flip side to that, Russia, 10% of their economic action comes from exports to the EU. They have way more to lose in this process. And even when you start digging into the oil situation, 52% of the federal government revenues come from the energy industry, and 79% of their exports go into the EU. So there's a hard line here where Russia has way more to lose in this situation. And therefore, we still think at the end of the day, cooler heads will prevail, even though there's a fairly uncool head at the table.
Well, that's why he hasn't come back with counter sanctions. You know that. He's got more to lose, Putin, than anybody here.
Absolutely, but you're also talking about sanctions on Russia, Russia being that one country. You can't put sanctions on ISIS, and we already know this.
Right.
I mean, and you talk about oil. I mean, remember, one thing about ISIS, I mean, them taking over some of these oil wells, these oil facilities in Iraq, you have they're getting somewhere, as KT McFarland was telling us, $2 million a day in oil royalties. So here's the other thing, Maria. You have any type of destabilization in that region, oil prices go higher. It's almost an enviable business model, because every time you have these threats, oil prices go higher and royalties are that much more.
Well, let's add something to that. You have to put a framework around this is to understand the impact here. Last time that we had an actual economic impact from an oil price spike, you had to have a 50 to 100% spike in oil prices to actually have it come through. Remember, in the U.S., less than 6% of our total economic action and consumer spending is directed towards energy. So you really have to have a meaningful spike to have a true economic impact.
Yeah, it's a great point. Yeah, we haven't really seen that. And I also think that there is a feeling broadly in the U.S. that the U.S. will be an energy exporter. And that's keeping a lid on prices, because there's just going to be enough supply of oil in the world.
Well, you would think so. And we have seen that, actually, where our supplies are at the highest they've ever been. And hopefully that will continue. But you still have, I mean, the Interior Department was actually saying we have enough natural gas off of our shores to heat every home in the United States for the next 10 years. So there's plenty more to do. Hopefully we'll get to that point.
All right.